Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
Today we're going to be looking at evictions in America. And as always, we're going beyond just the headlines. We want to get into the real nitty-gritty. So to do that, we're going to be taking a look at the book Evicted by Matthew Desmond. And I know what you might be thinking, oh, great, another book review. But I promise this is going to be much more than that.
Yeah, this is not your typical book review. This is like using this book Evicted as like a lens to look at a much wider picture.
Oh, yeah.
And we're talking the people, the policies, the really difficult choices that people have to make when it comes to housing, especially for low-income renters.
And I think one of the things that makes this book so powerful is that it really does personalize the eviction crisis, right?
Yeah.
We can all look at statistics and kind of go, oh, that's terrible. But when you read these stories about real people's lives, you can't help but feel the impact.
It is really striking just how much this book personalizes it. And I think that's what Desmond does so well. He really takes you right into the homes and the lives of these people. You're not just reading about numbers, you're reading about people's struggles, their relationships, and they're just trying to make ends meet.
And the book uses Milwaukee as a case study, right? So can you talk a little bit about the setting, the community that Desmond focuses on?
Yeah, so he really zooms in on Milwaukee's north side. And this is an area, with high eviction rates, lots of poverty, and really kind of a history, that's tied into these housing problems that they're seeing today.
Talk about that history a little bit. What are some of the factors that have led to the situation in Milwaukee?
Well, I mean, you go back and you think about the impact of deindustrialization, right? The loss of all those well-paying jobs. Then you layer on top of that the anti-welfare movements, back in the 90s. All of that kind of set the stage for the housing crisis that we see today in places like Milwaukee.
And then you have specific policies like Wisconsin Works or W-2. And wasn't that program supposed to help people get off welfare?
It was, yeah. That was the whole idea, reduce those welfare rolls. And it did. The question, though, is did those people actually end up better off?
Right.
A lot of folks, they ended up in these, low-wage jobs that still didn't pay enough to cover rent.
Feels like a trap almost, doesn't it?
It kind of is, yeah. You're trying to be self-sufficient, but you're still not making enough to afford a place to live. And, you think about a policy that's supposed to help, but maybe actually pushes more families toward eviction.
So in the midst of all this, you have landlords just trying to make a living, right? But the book introduces us to a landlord named Sharina. And she seemed to have a pretty unique perspective on the housing market.
Yeah, she's a fascinating character. Sharina sees what she calls the ghetto's value.
The ghetto's value.
She has figured out a way to make a profit from these properties that a lot of other people would just walk away from.
So she's making money off of properties that other people would consider worthless.
Yeah, run down, maybe in rougher neighborhoods. But her methods definitely raise some ethical questions.
Okay, like what? Give us the inside scoop here.
Well, she uses these loopholes in the legal system, putting it all on court documents.
All.
Yeah, so she can evict all occupants, not just the person named on the lease. And then there are all these added fees that she tacks onto tenants' bills, processing fees, things like that. It's like she's squeezing every dollar she can out of these folks.
She's profiting from people who are already struggling. I mean, that's kind of tough to swallow, isn't it?
It is. It's tough, and it really just shows how this system is kind of rigged against these lower income renters. Even programs that are designed to help, sometimes they end up benefiting the landlord more than the people that they're supposed to be helping.
No, not all landlords are like Sharina, right? The book also talks about a landlord named Tobin who has a different approach. Tell us about him.
Yeah, Tobin's interesting. He uses some of his tenants to manage properties and handle disputes. He's got Lenny overseeing the trailer park, and then there's Office Susie who acts as this kind of mediator. It's interesting to see that dynamic.
Oh, yeah. I bet that creates some interesting dilemmas, right? I mean, you've got these tenants who are trying to stay in good standing with their landlord, but at the same time, they're living in the same community, dealing with the same struggles as everyone else.
It really blurs the lines. It makes you ask, who's really benefiting from that kind of arrangement?
Yeah.
Is this about community, or is it just another way for the landlord to maintain control?
Okay, so we talked about the landlords, but we can't forget about the people at the heart of all of this, the tenants. And I was particularly struck by Arlene's story. I don't know if you remember her. But
oh, yeah, Arlene. Yeah.
She's a single mom who's just constantly battling to find a decent place for her and her kids. There's this really poignant detail in the book where Desmond describes her circling apartment listings, but intentionally avoiding any that require a background check.
Oh, yeah. And you can just feel the weight of those past evictions holding her back. You can just sense that desperation.
And it makes you realize how a single eviction can snowball, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It can turn into this huge problem.
Eviction leads to all kinds of instability. You're moving constantly, often into, worse and worse neighborhoods, makes it harder to hold down a job, keep the kids in school. It's just a really tough cycle to break.
Yeah, and then you factor in if you're living paycheck to paycheck and you have to come up with first and last month's rent security deposit every time you move. I mean, forget about getting ahead. You're just trying to survive at that point.
Absolutely. It's like you take one step forward and then, eviction knocks you 2 steps back.
And what about the emotional toll of all this?
Yeah.
We talked about the practical stuff, but just the stress, the anxiety of facing eviction, especially if you're a parent.
Yeah, I mean, imagine trying to provide for your kids, and just having that constant weight hanging over you. That's going to have a huge impact on your mental health.
It does. It does. And this is where you really see the limits of government assistance.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, programs like housing vouchers, they exist. But
yeah, but they're often underfunded and they come with all these restrictions.
So it's like well-intentioned, but not really meeting the scale of the need.
Right. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
Exactly. Exactly. Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the role of social networks. Because, Desmond talks about how tenants often rely on each other for support, especially in these tight-knit communities. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah. I mean, you see these informal networks that spring up and they're like lifelines, especially in communities where people are constantly facing these crises. Folks sharing food, clothes, watching each other's kids. It's just people helping people. Really a testament to their resilience and their sense of community.
But are these networks enough to really address the problem? It seems like they would be under a lot of strain.
They do help. But at the end of the day, these networks can only do so much.
Right.
Especially when the underlying issues of poverty and the lack of affordable housing, those things remain unaddressed. You see people step up and try to help each other, like Scott letting Pam stay with him when she gets evicted. But then there are times when that support just falls short.
So it comes back to, what role does government policy play in all this?
We can't just rely on these acts of kindness, right, to solve a problem this big. We have to look at the bigger picture, the policies that are driving this crisis in the first place.
So before we get into the specifics of potential solutions, I want to get your take on something. Desmond really emphasizes the broader impact of evictions, saying, this isn't just a personal problem, it's a societal one. What are your thoughts on that?
I think he's right. I mean, eviction ripples outward. Look at neighborhoods, right? High eviction rates lead to instability, declining property values, and you see this concentration of poverty. It creates this cycle that's really hard to break. And then you have the health consequences, especially for mothers and children. The stress, all of that can lead to a whole host of problems down the road.
Yeah, it's a pretty bleak picture. But, I think it's important to understand the scope of the problem before we can even start talking about solutions, right?
Absolutely. You can't fix what you don't understand. And Evicted does a really great job of kind of laying bare the complexities of this issue.
Okay, so now that we've established, how big of a problem this is, let's start digging into some of those potential solutions. And maybe the most talked about idea is this concept of a universal housing voucher program. Desmond really advocates for this.
He does.
Can you talk a little bit about how that would actually work?
Sure. So the basic idea is that instead of having this limited system where only a small percentage of families get help, a universal program would guarantee assistance to anyone who qualifies.
So in theory, everyone who needs help paying rent would get it regardless of, bureaucratic hurdles or waiting lists.
Exactly. It would be a huge shift.
Right.
Desmond argues it could be a game changer, drastically reducing evictions, reducing homelessness, just giving families the financial stability they need to actually stay housed.
Sounds great in theory, but I imagine there's some pretty big hurdles to overcome. What are some of the challenges?
Well, the biggest one is the cost. It would require a significant investment to implement a program like this. And, the political will to do that may not be there. You can already hear the arguments. It's too expensive. It's government overreach. It disincentivizes people from work. Like all those things that you hear. How do we even begin to address those concerns?
Well, Desmond argues that the cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of investing in a solution like this. You think about the downstream costs of eviction, increased healthcare expenditures, lost productivity, the fact that poverty just continues across generations. All those things cost money.
So it's not just about compassion, it's about smart policymaking.
Exactly. And then, the whole government overreach thing. I mean, we already have government programs that are designed to support people. This would just be an extension of that safety net. Recognizing that housing is a basic need. It's not a luxury, just like healthcare or food.
And as for the work disincentive, couldn't you argue that stable housing makes it easier for people to find and keep jobs? Absolutely. If you're constantly worried about losing your home, how can you focus on anything else? Providing that security allows people to put energy into finding a job, getting an education, building a better future.
So it's about creating a system that supports people, not
Right.
punishes them for being poor.
That's the goal. And, this isn't just a pie-in-the-sky idea. There are other countries that have implemented universal housing programs, and they've seen some success.
Tell me about that. What are some of the places that we can look at?
Well, Great Britain has the housing benefit. It's available to a lot of low-income families, often goes directly to landlords, which ensures the rent gets paid, and that lowers the risk of eviction. And they've seen a pretty big drop in homelessness.
That's a really interesting model. So it's not just about giving money to individuals. It's about creating a system that stabilizes the entire housing market.
Yes.
And that benefits everyone.
Yeah, it benefits everyone. Landlords are getting paid reliably. Tenants have the security of knowing they're not going to be kicked out. And then communities as a whole become more stable and vibrant.
It's amazing to see these programs working in other places.
Yeah.
And it gives me hope, that maybe something like that is possible here in America.
Desmond certainly believes that. He thinks we have the resources to make it happen. It's a bold vision. But as he points out, the cost of doing nothing is far greater than the cost of actually investing in a solution that could make a difference.
Well said.
Thank you.
And I think that is a perfect spot for us to take a break. We're going to come back and continue this conversation about evictions and potential solutions.
And, speaking of bold visions, Desmond doesn't just advocate for these universal programs. He also points out some of the flaws that are, baked into our existing assistance programs,
Yeah, he's pretty critical of how these programs are structured, even though they're supposed to be helping people.
Right. And one of the big issues is that they can create these perverse incentives for landlords.
Perverse incentives. What do you mean by that?
Well, think about Sharina. She actually made more money from her worst properties, the ones that were occupied by tenants who were receiving government assistance.
It's like the system rewards landlords for providing substandard housing.
It does.
That just doesn't seem right.
It's a huge ethical dilemma. Are we actually helping people escape poverty, or are we just kind of propping up a system that keeps them trapped?
Yeah. Are we treating the symptoms, or are we treating the disease right?
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to look at the unintended consequences of these programs. We talked about W-2 earlier, and while it did move people off welfare, it also pushed a lot of those folks into low-wage jobs without really addressing the root problem, which is housing affordability.
So are we just slapping a Band-Aid on a much bigger problem?
Yeah, and the result is more people struggling to pay rent and ultimately more evictions. Desmond makes this really key point about how interconnected everything is. Housing with all these other social issues. Eviction isn't just about losing your home.
Right.
It's about losing stability, opportunity, security. It impacts health, education, jobs, even family relationships. It's like this domino effect.
It's not just domino effect.
Yeah, it can trigger this downward spiral.
Yeah.
The book talks about job loss, family separation, mental health problems, even in some cases involvement in the criminal justice system.
Yeah. It's pretty heavy stuff. But again, I think it's important to understand that the full scope of the problem.
You have to see the whole picture.
If we're going to have any chance of finding solutions. So what are some of the things that we can do? How do we even begin to tackle a problem this big?
It's a good question. I don't think there are any easy answers. But Desmond, he does offer this framework for thinking about solutions. And he says we need a multi-pronged approach, one that addresses both the immediate needs of people facing eviction and also those systemic factors that keep this problem going.
Okay, so break that down for me. What does that look like in practice?
So immediately, we need to make sure people have access to legal representation when they're going through this process. Most tenants right now, they go through the whole thing without a lawyer.
Without a lawyer.
Yeah.
While landlords almost always have legal counsel.
It's like showing up to a gunfight with a knife.
Right.
And studies have shown that tenants who have legal representation, they're far less likely to get evicted. It gives them a fighting chance. Helps ensure the process is actually fair.
So that's on the immediate level. What about, those bigger systemic factors that you mentioned?
Well, investing in affordable housing is crucial.
Investing in affordable housing.
We just don't have enough housing units that people can actually afford. And when demand outstrips supply, prices go up. And who suffers? The people who can least afford it.
So we need to build more affordable housing.
We need to build more. But it's not just about new construction. We also have to preserve the affordable housing that already exists. We're losing units constantly to things like gentrification, demolition. They get converted to market rate housing. We need policies that protect those units and keep them affordable.
Okay, so how do we make that happen? How do we actually enact those policies?
It's a tough question. I think it requires a shift in priorities.
A shift in priorities.
We have to recognize that housing is a human right. It's not a commodity. And we need to invest in policies that reflect that.
That's a powerful message. Now, you mentioned earlier that landlords play a role in all of this. And it's easy to kind of paint them as the bad guys.
Right.
But I'm guessing it's a lot more complicated than that.
It is. Landlords are not a monolithic group. They have different motivations, different approaches. You have people like Sharina who are in it for the profit.
Right.
But then you also have landlords who genuinely care about their tenants and want to do the right thing.
So it's not just about demonizing all landlords. It's about how do we create a system that incentivizes responsible behavior.
That's exactly right. And that's where policy comes in. We need to reward landlords who are providing affordable, high-quality housing and hold accountable the ones who are exploiting their tenants.
Okay, so how would we do that? What are some concrete examples?
Well, you could offer tax breaks or other financial incentives to landlords who keep their rents affordable or who invest in improving their properties. Another approach is to strengthen tenant protections. Make it harder to evict someone without a really good reason.
So it's about creating a level playing field and making sure that the system is fair for everyone involved.
That's the goal. And, it's not just about landlords and tenants. It's about creating stronger, more vibrant communities. When people have stable housing, they're more likely to invest in their neighborhoods, support businesses, and just generally participate in civic life.
Everybody wins.
Exactly. Now, I know we talked about this earlier, but I want to go back to this idea of the power dynamics between landlords and tenants, because I think that's a really important point that Desmond makes in the book. He talks about how just the threat of eviction can shift that power balance, right?
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, that's fascinating to me. Because, you think about it, if you're a tenant and you could be evicted at any moment, are you really going to speak up and, demand repairs or challenge anything that seems unfair?
Probably not. It creates this atmosphere of fear. And even if a tenant has, legal grounds to fight an eviction, they may not feel empowered to do so.
Because the stakes are so high.
Exactly. You could lose your home. And that's why strong tenant protections are so important. Things like just cause eviction laws, that requires a landlord to have a legitimate reason for evicting someone. It helps prevent those arbitrary or retaliatory evictions.
So it's about ensuring that everyone has a voice and that everyone's rights are respected.
Exactly. And, it's about building a sense of community, shared responsibility.
Instead of an us versus them kind of mentality.
Right. We need to move away from that adversarial landlord-tenant relationship and towards something where both parties, recognize that they have a stake in creating a healthy, stable living environment.
It's about building bridges instead of walls. I like that.
And I think that really speaks to the larger theme of Evicted. This idea that we're all connected.
We're all connected.
We all have a role to play in solving this problem. It's not just about government policy or, individual actions. It's about creating this culture of empathy, understanding, and shared responsibility.
It's about seeing housing as a human right,
Yeah.
not a privilege.
Exactly. And I think that's a really good segue into talking about solutions. We've touched on a few already, but, Desmond lays out some pretty specific ideas in the book. I'd love to dig into some of those.
Okay, yeah. Let's dive into that a little bit. So one of the things that caught my eye was this idea of a housing court, which Desmond argues could be a much more effective way to handle these eviction cases.
Yeah.
Can you explain how that would work?
So basically, it would be a specialized court, dedicated to landlord-tenant disputes. And the idea is that, the judges would have expertise in housing law and would be better equipped to, really understand these cases.
So it's a more specialized and informed approach.
Exactly. And a housing court could also offer resources, to both landlords and tenants. Things like mediation services, legal aid, information about housing rights and responsibilities.
So it's more holistic, right? You're not just looking at the legal issues. You're trying to address the underlying social and economic factors.
Right. And Desmond says this kind of court could actually help prevent evictions from happening in the first place, by providing early intervention.
So it's not just about, who wins and who loses. It's about finding solutions that benefit everyone.
That's the goal. And, this isn't just a theoretical idea. Housing courts already exist in some cities.
Oh, really?
And they've shown some success in, lowering eviction rates and just creating more equitable outcomes for everyone involved.
That's good to hear. Gives me a little bit of hope,
Me too.
that maybe we can actually make this system work better.
And, I think Evicted is a really great roadmap for how we can do that. It challenges us to think differently about housing, about poverty, about, the role of government in all of this.
Yeah, it's one of those books that really stays with you, even after you finish reading it.
Absolutely. And, one of the most valuable things about it is that it focuses on these human stories.
Right.
It would be easy to just get lost in the statistics and the policy debates. But when you hear about people like Arlene, Lorraine, it really brings the issue home.
It does. And it reminds us that this isn't just an abstract problem. It's about real people's lives.
It's about our responsibility to create a society where everyone has a chance.
Well said. One thing that I keep thinking about is how well Desmond balances those personal stories with the bigger picture stuff. Like, it's not just, oh, these people are having a hard time. It's, here's how policies and history and even just like how we think about stuff plays into this whole thing.
Yeah, he's really good at connecting those dots, like how something that happened way back, like deindustrialization, can still be affecting housing today. Or, like we said before, how a policy like W-2, which was supposed to help, might actually be making things worse for some folks.
Well said. Thanks so much for being here today. This has been a really great conversation.
It's been my pleasure, and I hope this is just the beginning. Let's keep talking, keep pushing for change, and never stop fighting for a better world.
To our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Thanks for listening.